The smallest girl would not let go of her skirt. Mara Whitfield had been standing in the doorway of the Montana cabin for less than 3 minutes, snow melting off her boots onto the rough pine floor, and the child, no more than 4 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a face smudged with what looked like yesterday's supper, had wrapped both fists into the worn wool and was pulling with the kind of desperation that comes from drowning. The widowed cowboy stood 10 feet back with his arms crossed, his jaws set, watching his daughter cling to a stranger he had hired by letter and met by necessity. He said nothing. The 2 older boys stood behind him like sentries, silent and hollow-eyed, and in the corner near the cold stove sat a basket with a baby inside, whimpering the way infants do when they have learned that crying brings nothing. If you have ever watched someone arrive in a place where hope left long ago, you know the feeling that is rising in your chest right now. This is a story about a woman who came to cook for one winter in a house where grief had burned everything down to ash, and what happened when 4 children decided she was the only thing left worth holding on to. If this is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Mara Whitfield did not know, standing in that doorway with a child wrapped around her legs and a man who had forgotten how to speak watching her like she was the last match in a wet box, was that she had just walked into the only winter that would ever matter. Mara had buried her husband in October of 1887, 2 months before the first snow fell on their Kansas homestead. Thomas Whitfield had been a good man and a poor farmer, and when the fever took him, it left her with a paid-off burial plot, a trunk of clothes, and $9 she had earned taking in laundry from the men who worked the railroad depot. She was 32 years old. She was heavy-set in the way that made other women at the general store step aside when she reached for the same bolt of fabric, not out of courtesy, but out of something else, something that lived in the corner of their eyes when they looked at her and then looked away too quickly. She had learned young that the world made room for her body only when she made herself useful, so she had spent her entire life being useful. She could cook for 20 men on a wood stove with 3 burners. She could butcher a hog, render the lard, and have sausage hanging by morning. She could take flour and water and a pinch of salt and turn it into something that made grown men go quiet at the table. When the advertisement appeared in the Hardin Creek newspaper, "Wanted, cook for remote ranch, 4 children, winter term, room and board, wages paid in full at spring thaw," she read it 3 times, folded the paper, and wrote her reply before the ink on the listing had dried. She did not ask about the wages. She did not ask why a man with 4 children needed to hire a stranger. She asked only for the address and the date he wanted her to arrive. She arrived on the 3rd of December with 2 trunks and a small wooden box that held her grandmother's rolling pin, and when Jesse Cole opened the door of his cabin, she saw in his face what she had seen in every mirror for the last 2 months. A person who had survived something they were not supposed to survive and did not know what to do with the fact that they were still breathing. He was tall and thin, in the way men get when they forget to eat, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and hands that looked like they had been working without rest since the day he was born. He did not smile. He did not welcome her. He said, "You are the cook," as if he needed to confirm she was real. And when she said yes, he nodded once and stepped aside. That was when the smallest girl grabbed her skirt. Jesse Cole's wife had died in June, delivering the baby that now lay silent in the basket by the stove. The birth had gone wrong in ways the midwife from town could not fix, and by the time the bleeding stopped, Sarah Cole was gone. The boys, Eli, 9, and Samuel, 7, had stopped speaking in full sentences by July. The girl, Pearl, had stopped sleeping through the night. The baby, Rose, had stopped growing at the rate babies are supposed to grow. And Jesse had stopped doing anything that was not strictly required to keep livestock alive and children fed. He burned porridge 3 mornings a week. He forgot to light the stove on the days he remembered it existed. He stood in the barn at night staring at the wall until the cold drove him back inside. When his nearest neighbor, a man named Amos Pritchett, who ran cattle on the next ridge over, suggested he hire help for the winter, Jesse had written the advertisement with the same blank efficiency he used to shoe a horse. He did not want company. He wanted someone to perform the tasks his wife had performed, so he did not have to think about the fact that she was not there to perform them. Mara unpacked her trunks in the small room off the kitchen that Jessie told her had been used for storage. There was a narrow bed, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a window that overlooked the barn and the open stretch of land beyond it. She hung her 2 dresses on nails in the wall, set her grandmother's rolling pin on the chair, and walked back into the main room, where Pearl was still standing in the exact spot Mara had left her, staring at the door as if she expected Mara to vanish. Mara knelt down so her face was level with the child's face and said, "I am going to make supper now. You can watch if you want." Pearl did not answer, but when Mara stood and walked to the stove, the girl followed. The first thing Mara did was light the stove properly. The second thing she did was inventory what was in the cabin. There was cornmeal, flour, a sack of potatoes with more eyes than flesh, salt pork in a barrel, dried beans, and a tin of lard that had gone rancid enough to smell like old coins. There were no vegetables, no preserves, no butter, no eggs. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the time the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the temperature inside the cabin had started to fall, Mara had made a pot of bean soup with salt pork, cornbread in the Dutch oven, and biscuits that she served with the last scraping of honey she found in a jar behind the flour sack. The smell filled the cabin the way light fills a room when you open the shutters after a long darkness. It was the smell of rendered fat and browning flour and beans cooked slow with a ham hock until the broth turned thick and savory. It was the smell of a kitchen where someone was paying attention. Jessie came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway. He did not say anything, but Mara saw his shoulders drop half an inch, as if some string that had been holding him upright had been cut. The boys came to the table without being called. Pearl climbed into the chair closest to Mara and did not take her eyes off her. The baby woke and started to fuss, and Mara crossed the room, lifted Rose from the basket, and held her against one hip while she ladled soup into bowls with her free hand. She had done this 1,000 times. A body in motion, a child on the hip, food on the table. It was the only language she had ever spoken fluently. They ate in silence. Eli finished his bowl and stared at the bottom of it like he was reading something written there. Samuel ate 3 biscuits and then a 4th. Pearl ate half her soup and spent the other half of the meal watching Mara's hands move. Jessie ate without looking up, and when he was finished, he set his spoon down, stood, and said, "That was good." Then he walked out the door and did not come back until the fire had burned down to coals. The days that followed formed a rhythm. Mara woke before dawn and lit the stove. She made porridge with cinnamon and a little sugar if there was sugar, or with salt and a pat of lard if there was not. She packed lunches for the boys when Jessie took them out to check the cattle or mend the fences. She baked bread every 3rd day. She made stews and roasts and pot pies with whatever she could coax out of the root cellar. She sang while she worked, old hymns her grandmother had taught her, songs with no words, melodies she made up as she went. Pearl followed her everywhere. If Mara was kneading dough, Pearl stood beside the table with her hand resting on Mara's skirt. If Mara was sweeping, Pearl held the dustpan. If Mara was folding laundry, Pearl sat on the floor and folded cloths into uneven squares that Mara refolded without comment. The baby stopped whimpering and started making the small cooing sounds that babies make when they feel safe. The boys began to speak in full sentences again, first to each other, then to Mara, then, by the week before Christmas, to their father. Jessie did not speak much, but he began to be present in the room when Mara was in it. He sat at the table after supper instead of walking out immediately. He watched her move through the kitchen with the same focus he used to watch a horse he was breaking, as if he were trying to understand something he did not have the words to ask about. One night in late December, after the children had gone to bed, he said, "You do not have to stay up. I can bank the fire." Mara looked up from the sock she was darning and said, "I know." He nodded slowly, as if she had answered a question he had not asked, and then he said, "My wife used to sit in that chair." Mara set the sock down. She said, "Would you like me to sit somewhere else?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "No." The winter deepened. Snow came in waves, 3 feet at a time, and the world outside the cabin disappeared into white. Mara made dried apple dumplings and vinegar pie, and a roast that fell apart under a fork. She made soft bread for Rose when the baby was old enough to eat it, and she taught Pearl how to crack eggs without getting shell in the bowl. She watched Jessie come in from the cold every night with his face red and his hands stiff, and she had hot coffee waiting every time. She did not ask him about his wife. She did not ask him what he was thinking when he stared into the fire for an hour without moving. She simply kept the house warm, and the children fed, and the silence comfortable. It was Eli who broke first. In the second week of January, he came into the kitchen while Mara was rolling out pie dough and said, "Are you going to leave when winter is over?" Mara stopped rolling. She looked at the boy, 9 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's serious eyes, and said, "That was the agreement." Eli nodded. Then he said, "Pearl thinks you are staying forever." Mara wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "What do you think?" Eli looked at the floor. He said, "I think if you leave, she is going to stop talking again." Then he walked out of the kitchen before Mara could answer. That night, after the children were in bed, Jesse asked Mara to sit. He had poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and he was standing near the stove with his hands in his pockets, looking at her the way a man looks at something he is afraid will disappear if he looks away. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I do not know how to ask it." Mara waited. He said, "When you came here, I hired you to cook. That is all I hired you to do. But my children—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. He said, "Pearl has not asked for her mother in 3 weeks. Rose laughs now. The boys talk at supper. I do not know what you have done, but I know that when you leave, this house is going to go back to what it was before you came. And I do not think we can survive that again." Mara did not move. She said, "What are you asking me?" Jesse turned to face her. He said, "I am asking if you would consider staying, not just through winter, permanently. I know that is not what we agreed. I know you have a life you left behind. But if there is any chance you would stay, I am asking." Mara looked at him. She saw a man who had been hollowed out by loss and was standing in front of her with nothing left but honesty. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because my children need you, because this house needs you, because I—" He stopped. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Because I forgot what it felt like to come home to something warm, and I do not want to forget again." Mara stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow, at the barn half buried in white, at the dark line of trees on the ridge. She thought about the homestead in Kansas with its empty rooms and its silent table. She thought about the $9 she had saved and the way the women in the general store had looked at her. She thought about Pearl's hand on her skirt and the way Rose reached for her in the mornings and the way Eli had said, "She is going to stop talking again," as if that were a fate worse than anything else he could imagine. She thought about Jesse standing in the doorway every night, watching her the way a man watches the sun come up after a long darkness. She turned around. She said, "I will stay." Jesse exhaled. It was the first time she had seen him smile since the day she arrived. He said, "Thank you." She said, "But you need to understand something. I am not your wife. I will never be your wife. I will cook and I will care for the children and I will keep this house the way it needs to be kept. But I will not pretend to be someone I am not." He said, "I am not asking you to be my wife. I am asking you to stay." She said, "Then I will stay." 3 weeks later, Amos Pritchett came by the ranch to drop off a side of venison and saw Mara in the yard hanging laundry with Pearl at her side. He stood in the doorway of the barn where Jesse was working and said, "You kept the cook." Jesse said, "I did." Amos said, "Good. My wife was worried about those children." Then he looked at Jesse for a long moment and said, "Sarah would have liked her." Jesse did not answer, but he nodded once, and Amos left without saying anything else. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in patches, and the first green shoots appeared in the mud near the creek. Mara planted a garden behind the cabin. Potatoes, carrots, beans, squash. Pearl helped her dig the rows. Rose learned to walk, holding onto Mara's skirt for balance. The boys started laughing again, the kind of laughing that comes from deep in the belly and cannot be stopped. And Jesse began to speak in full sentences, the kind of sentences that included the future tense. One evening in April, after supper, Jesse said, "I need to go into town next week to settle accounts with the feed store. I thought maybe you and the children could come." Mara looked up. She had not been to Hardin Creek since the day she arrived. She said, "All right." They went on a Saturday. The boys rode in the back of the wagon. Pearl sat between Mara and Jesse on the bench, and Rose sat in Mara's lap. The town was small, a main street with a general store, a post office, a church, and a saloon. When they pulled up in front of the store, people stopped and stared. Mara saw the looks. She had seen them her whole life. Women whispering behind gloved hands, men looking and then looking away. She kept her face forward and climbed down from the wagon. Inside the store, the owner, a thin man named Horace Bellamy, nodded at Jesse and said, "Good to see you, Cole. And who is this?" He was looking at Mara the way people look at livestock they are considering purchasing. Jesse stepped forward and said, "This is Mara Whitfield. She is part of my household now. You will treat her with respect." Horace blinked. He said, "Of course, I did not mean—" Jesse cut him off. He said, "Yes, you did. She keeps my home. She cares for my children. She has done more for this family in 4 months than anyone in this town has done in 4 years. If you have a problem with that, I will take my business elsewhere." The store went quiet. Mara felt Pearl's hand slip into hers. She felt Rose shift against her hip. She felt every eye in the room on her, and she waited. Horace cleared his throat. He said, "No problem at all, Jesse. Ma'am, welcome." He nodded at Mara, and the rest of the store slowly turned back to what they had been doing. Jesse looked at Mara. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Sugar, flour, yeast if he has it." He said, "Get whatever you need, and get something for yourself." She said, "I do not need anything for myself." He said, "I know. Get it anyway." That night, after the children were asleep, Mara sat in the chair by the fire and unwrapped the package Jesse had insisted she take from the store. Inside was a bolt of dark blue calico and a card of horn buttons. She ran her hand over the fabric and felt the weight of it, soft and sturdy and meant to last. She looked up and saw Jesse watching her from across the room. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you say those things in the store?" He walked over and sat down in the chair across from her. He said, "Because they were true, and because I wanted them to know." She said, "Know what?" He said, "That you are not hired help. You are family." Mara looked at him. She saw a man who had been broken and had learned to stand again. She saw a man who had 4 children who laughed at the table, and a house that smelled like bread, and a future that no longer looked like an empty room. She saw a man who had looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her before. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with gratitude so deep it had no bottom. She said, "Thank you." He said, "No, thank you." The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. Mara stayed through that spring and the summer and the winter that came after it. She stayed through the year Pearl turned 6 and started school. She stayed through the year Samuel broke his arm falling out of the hayloft, and Eli learned to ride well enough to help his father with the cattle. She stayed through the year Rose said her first word, which was not Mama, but Mara. And Jesse built an addition onto the cabin so the boys could have their own room. She stayed through the drought of 1889 and the hard winter of 1891, and the year the cattle prices dropped so low Jesse thought he might lose the ranch. And somewhere in those years, in the quiet moments between supper and bedtime, in the mornings when she woke to find Jesse already up and stoking the fire so the house would be warm when she came out, in the evenings when they sat together after the children were asleep and talked about nothing and everything, somewhere in those moments, Jesse stopped being the man who had hired her and became the man who loved her. He never said it outright. He showed it in the way he carried water from the creek without being asked. He showed it in the way he built her a bench for the garden and a shelf for her spices, and a rocking chair that fit her exactly. He showed it in the way he looked at her when she was not looking at him, the way a man looks at the sun. And Mara, who had spent her whole life being useful, learned that she was not just useful. She was essential. She was wanted. She was loved. The children never called her mother. They called her Mara. But when Pearl got married in 1902, she asked Mara to stand beside her. When Eli brought his first girl home to meet the family, he introduced Mara as the woman who raised him. When Samuel went to work on the railroad and wrote letters home, he addressed them to Pa and Mara. And when Rose had her first child, she named the baby Sarah Mara Cole, after the mother she never knew and the woman who taught her what a mother was. Jesse and Mara never married. There was no proposal, no ceremony, no legal document that tied them together. But every person in Hardin Creek knew that the woman at the coal ranch was not the cook. She was the heart of that house. She was the reason it still stood. She was the reason 4 children grew up knowing what love looked like, even after loss. And when Jesse Cole died in the winter of 1918, 31 years after he had written an advertisement for a cook, and received a reply from a woman in Kansas he had never met. Mara Whitfield was the one holding his hand. Pearl was there, Eli was there, Samuel was there, Rose was there. And in the last moment, Jessie looked at Mara and said the only thing that mattered. "You stayed." She said, "I stayed." The ranch stayed in the family for 3 more generations. The house was added onto, rebuilt, modernized. But in the kitchen, on a shelf above the stove, there remained a small wooden box with a rolling pin inside. And every Cole child who grew up in that house was told the same story. This belonged to the woman who came to cook for one winter and stayed forever. Because sometimes the person you need is not the person you were expecting. And sometimes the life you build is better than the life you planned.